So Andre SOG Ward has retired. Retired as champ, as undefeated champ, incidentally. It's 32-0, 16 knockouts. I wanted to give my thoughts on him, on his career, and what have you. Had a very good career, a very good career. I mean, a lot of guys would kill to have a career like he did. Made. I mean, both in the financial aspect as well as the critical aspect. Albeit the critical aspect, there are certain holes here and there, I guess you may say. Um, Really, Andre Ward's real kind of emergence onto the big scene, onto the big stage, onto the mainstream scene, and to a degree, was the Super Six. Going into the Super Six, he was one of the biggest underdogs there because of the fact that he had never fought at that high of a level before. The only guys he had fought up until that point were pretty much also rans, journeymen, tomato cans, all the different words that you have for guys that are basically brought in to lose, guys that are supposed to lose, guys that you're supposed to beat, especially for Andre Ward because he was an Olympic gold medalist, the last American Olympic gold medalist, save Clarissa Shields, the last male gold Olympic boxing medalist. But yeah, that Super Six run was it was a solid one. It wasn't necessarily looking back. This like amazing, absolutely incredible feat necessarily, but it was very, very solid. I mean, you'd be very hard pressed to think of another run that another fighter really had that was that good over that period, over the about 2 years or so. The plus, when I'm including Chad Dawson, the Chad Dawson fight, that right after the Super Six, you'd be hard pressed to find a better run than that one. There's only a few guys that I think could think of off the top of my head that really had runs that were that good. I mean, you got Tim Bradley a few years back. Marquez had a pretty solid one like that. Abner Mares, I remember back when he was kind of battling with Ward and with Floyd Mayweather as a pound for pounder. And speaking of pound for pound, it's really funny because I remember back right around between the time when Ward defeated Carl Froch and then when he defeated Chad Dawson, I was in the minority of people that was saying that, I think Andre Ward just displaced Floyd Mayweather as the pound for pound number one. And, and this is saying a lot because of the fact that during this entire period, during pretty much most of the past decade plus, I've been called a Flomo and a Floyd Mayweather nut hugger and all kinds of other bullshit online by various people. Simply for telling it like it is with regard to him and Pacquiao, with the way that I saw it and the way that it eventually became, the way that it turned out exactly as I'd pretty much imagined all those years earlier, regardless of whether it took place later than it should have or what have you. They're both just as faded nowadays as they ever have been. I mean, really, their career trajectories in terms of their reflexes and stuff are virtually about the same, I'd say. I wouldn't say that Pacquiao faded any quicker than Floyd, but I digress with regard to that. But yeah, I mean, right around that time, I did think that Andre Ward deserved to be the pound for pound number one. He eventually lost that perch, because of his inactivity, of course, and ultimately I think his inactivity kind of harms him in an all-time sense. When you're trying to compare him to other all-time greats, I mean, within his own era, definitely, one of the top guys. But when you're comparing him to everybody in history, that it ultimately does take effect there. Whereas, like say, like a Muhammad Ali, even after that gap that he had where he hadn't been fighting, he had an incredible run. All-time. Like when you want to talk about all-time great run, that's a reason. That's one of the reasons why people call him the greatest, aside from just the fact that he called himself the greatest over and over again as a young man. But he did eventually, I feel, kind of get back to around that spot, kind of going head-to-head, neck and neck with Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez. And that's kind of the funny thing about it is, it seems like a lot of these people online went from talking a lot of shit about Andre Ward and saying like, oh no, he's not the pound for pound. Floyd Mayweather's a pound for pound now, here, today, yesterday, tomorrow, and forever. Like, Andre Ward ain't shit compared to Floyd Mayweather. Then all of a sudden, I guess like when Floyd basically was retired, quote unquote, semi-retired in the last couple of years, all of a sudden all these guys suddenly are in love with Andre Ward now, and suddenly he's the pound for pound god. But I guess that's what happens when they Turker Gerbs and somebody that looks like Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez ascends to the pound for pound throne and takes it by virtue of the fact that he chased greatness and he dared to be great and he was great. Now, unfortunately, it may not necessarily be as great anymore, but I guess that remains to be seen. They are talking about him fighting Kalyafai fairly soon after all, and see, that's another one, man. Just taking that many risks. It's not something that should necessarily be, I think, detracted from. I think, especially in this era, with regards to a lot of fighters playing that risk versus reward game constantly. Like Boxing Beats and Rhymes said in a recent video, it's like boxing is just one big duck, everybody ducking each other. It's unfortunate, and that I guess leads me to Andre Ward unfortunately missing out on Adonis Stevenson. Not unlike in a certain way that he missed out on Lucien Bute, although in a way he could be forgiven for that to a certain degree because of the fact that Carl Froch did go on to knock Boudet out. And, when Froch did that, pulled off that big upset and everything, at that point I was like, well, hey, all that did really was bolster Ward's claim that, he was really better to begin with. But ultimately, styles do make fights. The reason why they fight the fights is for just that reason. Sometimes guys that seem like they may be predicted to do one thing or whatever, they don't. And incidentally, really Ward was probably going to be the underdog, slight underdog, but underdog going into that fight with Boudet. Here against Stevenson, had he chose to continue and fight Stevenson, I think he probably would have been the favorite against Stevenson. But I don't think he would have won that fight. I think that Adonis Stevenson would have beat him. And ultimately, I think that Andre Ward may have felt that way as well. And Andre Ward isn't really too dissimilar from Floyd Mayweather, incidentally, where he eventually did, not at first, of course, pre Super 6 or in the Super 6 and such. He fought the guys that were put in front of him, and he fought the best guys right there at super middleweight, so you got to give him full credit for that. But in the aftermath of that, and then with his issues with Goosen, and then his comeback, it seemed like he was taking a lot more of a page out of that risk versus reward book that is so commonplace nowadays, particularly at most of the weights above like feather and super featherweight. And it's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate because I would have liked to have at least seen him go out there and give it a try, basically. Because had he beat Stevenson, had he unified, then, there's no shadow of a doubt as to him being a pound for pound number one. There was no question about it. Even with Chocolatito's loss to Srisaket Rungvisai, the fact of the matter is the man was at his fourth weight. He's a fat guy, that's had a lot of fights, and he was at his fourth weight against a brutal knockout artist, an absolutely brutal knockout artist, which is, funny enough, exactly what Adonis Stevenson is, albeit at Ward's second weight, but still, there are certain parallels there. Stevenson, regardless of his age, is as dangerous as ever, and just like Srisaket, who's actually older than Chocolatito by a few months, I believe, he was a fresher fighter, and Stevenson, funny enough, I'd say is probably a fresher fighter than Andre Ward. I think Ward, all the injuries that he suffered the last few years, I know he had like a couple of rotator cuff pulls and stuff like that, whereas Stevenson has been relatively healthy, which is, I guess, somewhat surprising for a guy his age, although he did start late, so not unlike Sergio Martinez, who really showed no wear and tear on him until he fought freaking Julio Cesar, heavyweight Chavez, or however the fuck much he weighed in that fight. He kind of got ruined in that last round, unfortunately for him. But, all that said, though, I think a lot of people get it twisted, just the fact that you could be in the discussion of being a pound for pounder, not even the number one pound for pounder, but pound for pound top 10 at all. That means that to me that says you're absolutely a Hall of Famer. You are definitely a Hall of Famer. Either first ballot or second ballot. Depending on who the first ballot happens to be, and that's a tricky one this year because this year Shane Mosley announced his retirement, Juan Manuel Marquez announced his retirement, Floyd Mayweather will probably have this year as his final one before his permanent retirement, thanks to the Conor McGregor fight. Vladimir Klitschko has announced his retirement. Miguel Cotto is probably going to be retired by the end of the year, if he holds true to his word, which I think he will. And I know that I'm pretty sure it's with Canastota that they only induct 3 modern day fighters each year. I'm pretty sure that that's the limit. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I could have sworn it was 3 modern day fighters, 2 past greats, like 2 from like a era previous, where I think it's got to be more than 30 or 35 years retired or something crazy, something from a long time ago. Whereas the modern fighters, they only got to be retired for 5 years. So 5 years from now, ultimately, some of those holes that I mentioned earlier, not fighting Stevenson, not getting a chance to fight Bude, the inactivity, will I think ultimately hurt Ward when it comes to being first ballot. I think, well, I mean, it might hurt Ward. I mean, now that I'm thinking about it, I could see Mayweather, Marquez, and Ward being the 3 that get inducted first ballot. And then Bradley, Mosley, Klitschko, probably getting held until the following year, most likely. Just if you're looking at overall what they accomplished at what weights and things like that. And even just kind of bringing up those other names, like Marquez in particular. Marquez is a guy that never. Well, I mean, I wouldn't even necessarily want to say that he never quite reached number 1 pound for pound, because he actually even had an argument for number 1 pound for pound too, years back, right around the time when Mayweather was inactive after the Hatton fight, before Mayweather went back to fight Marquez. And I remember that fight was billed as who's number 1, because if you are one of the people like myself who thought that Marquez did beat Pacquiao in that second fight in particular, between the second and the third fight there, he really deserved to be at least top 3 pound for pound, up there with Pacquiao and Hopkins, if not number 1. And so I considered him number 1. And so just like the billing was on for that fight, I definitely took that serious. But once again, I digress. But it's one of those things that I think has to be brought up when you're talking about Andre Ward, a fighter that had a career like his, where the trajectory was kind of a bit up and down, and it culminated with a good win over Kovalev, albeit I guess a somewhat controversial one because of the manner in which it ended, with him clocking Kovalev in the nuts a bunch of times. But hey, Ward was never necessarily a stranger to being a gritty fighter. So sometimes you got to deal with the cards that you've been dealt. And unfortunately for Sergey, he didn't. And so all the salt that he's trying to throw Ward's away now, saying that he retired and all that stuff, is just pure nonsense. It's the ramblings of a man who is ultimately ashamed that Andre Ward went in there and beat him twice officially. I thought that Kovalev won the first fight, but Ward rocked the crap out of his jaw in that second fight. And I mean, even aside from the low blows, it was looking real bad for Kovalev. It was looking really bad. So I wouldn't have doubted that Ward could have stopped him regardless of hitting him low in the aftermath of that. But yeah, man, a great career for Andre Ward. Ultimately, I do think the last couple of years he was a bit overrated by the people that used to hate him. Funny enough, all these haters all of a sudden turned dick riders. But hey, I guess that's what happens when you allow certain aesthetics to actually cloud your vision. But that's gonna do it for me, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.